think one of the main things as a parent, we tend to see certain discrepancies in children. Every child is quite an individual. Some are interested in sports, some aren't interested in sport, some are more into arts, some are not. Some have focus issues more than others. As parents, we all want our kids to be socially fitting the norm or athletically fitting the norm. But we tend to come into conclusions that, oh, little Johnny, for example, doesn't fit the bill. Maybe that's just him. And we tend to then foster that type of personality. But in most cases, what we don't see is that underlying that characteristic is this thing called primitive reflexes. Primitive reflexes are a form of behavioral anxiety or essentially more or less a movement problem. These primitive reflexes are something that I think as parents and as the public community is worthwhile understanding.
So primitive reflexes are quite essential. They're essential for survival and they're essential for interaction with the environment. So examples of one of the primitive reflexes is what we call the palmar reflex, which is when I place a finger in the baby's hand, they will tend to grasp. Now that's an important action for survival in the early childhood. So what happens when these reflexes actually linger around past the first 1.5 to 2 years of our life? Now I've got an example of a great case that came in 2 months ago. A 4-year-old boy, Harley. His mum brought him in and he was carrying a pillow behind his back that cradled in his arms. He's looking at the ground. He came in, very shy boys, sat in the corner, didn't say a word, and mum was expressing her concerns about he had difficulties with focus, he had difficulties with learning, generally very irritable, according to mum. One of the things that we found was he actually had a primitive reflex present. There were other findings to go with that as well, but one of the key findings was that he was very sensitive in his lower back. So the way I interpreted that scenario is that he feels very vulnerable, that area of his body touching either the back of the chair or carrying a backpack. So he actually cradled that pillow just to provide a bit of support between himself and almost to a point of distancing himself from the environment. And that kind of made him socially a little bit awkward, and he didn't develop the language to be able to explain himself. Okay. So one of the things that we worked with, obviously we gave him some exercises over the next few weeks to get that reflex to disappear. And one of the amazing things that we saw with Harley was that when he came out of that after about 4 to 6 weeks, he could look into your eyes and actually hold a conversation.
It's quite fantastic to see that mom had this intuitive understanding of bringing the child to see you, because that child would have been probably labeled as on the spectrum, or that child would have been labeled as a hyperactive or a attention deficit suffering child. That child actually had a retained reflex and that it's easily treatable with specific exercises.
So what are the signs that people or the parents can actually look out for in their kids with potential primitive reflex symptoms? So we can look at things like anxiety. They may have focus difficulties, they may have learning difficulties at school and at home. They may not be generally engaging with you in their conversations. They may be very irritable. They may have a few tantrums. There's some of the many symptoms that can present when there's an underlying issue with a primitive reflex.
In treatment, it's very important that we introduce safety to the nervous system. That's what therapy is all about, is to be able to find the right exercises to calm the primitive reflex down. When the body feels threatened, it's going to try to communicate with you. These reflexes are a means of communication, and pain, a sensation of alarm, is also a means of communication. So it's important to introduce safety in the body during therapy, whether we're treating senses or reflexes or even pain.